You are listening to the Julie Parker Practice Success Podcast, where you discover management insights and strategies for a successful dental practice. There are also interviews with key people in the industry who have advice and services to help you and your team achieve great success. Welcome to this week's episode of the Julie Parker Practice Success Podcast. And this week's topic is a very big topic, and I am very happy that we've got our legal advisors here to tell us what to do in this kind of day and age of the COVID situation. So Burke Associates Lawyers have helped us out on a number of topics in the past and will be doing in the future as well. We've got one of the other principals of the practice, Rosy Roberts, joining us today to talk about COVID and vaccinations, mandates, and how it affects us in the dental practice situation. Welcome, Rosy.
Thank you so much, Julie. Thanks for having me today. It is definitely a huge topic. At the moment, it is ever evolving throughout Australia and will continue to do so, but I would be happy to provide your listeners with a bit of guidance today, a bit of sort of where to start to keep an eye on these things moving forward, and so they can plan for their practices moving into next year, which will hopefully be COVID-free.
We can only have our fingers and toes crossed, Rosie. It's been such a huge disruption to everyone's lives. And, we have tried to manoeuvre as best we can through the lockdowns and the restricted way of practicing for dental practices around Australia. But this whole mandated vaccination process, this is another kettle of fish that we're having to try to sift through and figure out what to do as practice owners. And so I really do appreciate your eagerness to come on board and talk to us about this. I know that there's going to be some questions that you may not be able to answer, but you'll certainly be able to answer many of the questions that I've got and that the dental fraternity out there have as well. So let's just start from the very top, Rosie. Dental practice, for a start, I do want to say that you are in Victoria, so you know the Victorian legislation very well, as opposed to the whole of Australia, but you'll be able to give us some kind of indication possibly of what Australia-wide looks like.
Yes, definitely, Julie. I mean, in each state and territory, there is a legal framework by which each of the state and territory governments have been enacting directions, I guess, and that's, for example, in Victoria, we have the public health orders, and they've been made pursuant to, there's a Public Health and Wellbeing Act down here in Victoria that allows the government to be able to make these directions that we are all trying to abide by as we move through. Now, there's more in terms of where these directions go in the future. I'm sure your listeners are aware there are these frameworks and these directions are constantly being updated. We have legislation that's currently being passed or attempting to be passed. That's a Victorian reference through our parliaments at the moment.
You're talking about the bill?
We are talking about the bill, yes, and the people at the moment who are protesting on the steps of our parliament as we speak. And then we've got the cases in the courts. So there are a number of cases throughout Australia that are in court, and they're questioning the legality of a number of matters, including these vaccination mandates. So whilst we would love to see, obviously, some sort of really easy reference to how we move forward and how we are expected to deal with these and how we manage this in our daily lives and in dental practices and surgeries throughout Australia, there is not yet that answer. We do not yet have that way of moving forward that gives us some certainty. So it is an ever-evolving area, and I do encourage all of your listeners, whilst I can give a client advice one day, it may change the next. So it really is a matter of keeping up to date with those directions that are in place, and then looking at how that should be applied to you and your practices.
Fantastic. Well, let's start at the top. Dental practices in Australia, or in Victoria, as you know more so, do all staff members who come on site need to be vaccinated?
So currently for Victoria, that is correct. Yes, we have a public health order in place that is specified for healthcare facilities, which is defined to include dental surgeries and practices. And that includes all of the workers. There are some definitions around the dental practitioners and then administrative staff and what those different levels fall within, as to the mandatory vaccination and being able to attend a work premises. Now, obviously, if you can work from home and there is that requirement available, the ability, to be able to do that available, that is then not required. It really is if you are present in a premises, that public health order applies at the moment.
So anyone working off-site virtually in any way, they don't need to be double vaccinated?
Yeah, that's correct. They can work from home as they have been doing. It really is the limit is on people actually attending certain premises.
And how about, dental practices get many visitors, not just patients. They get courier drivers, they get dental representatives from companies as well. What about all the visitors that come through to a dental practice? Where does the practice lie in terms of they may be using the services of another business on a regular basis, but they're not a direct employee?
So those sorts of, say we're talking about sort of third parties, as it were, that were attending the premises, it really depends whether they fall within those definitions in the public health order as to whether they're required to be vaccinated or not. If they fall within those specified directions, then they are required to be. But if they don't fall within those specific directions and definitions, it really is a matter for each of the practices to sort of consider whether or not there is a requirement for those people to be vaccinated before they attend the premises. And that really is looking at the business and the risk to those staff members and patients that may be at the premises as to whether or not they want to allow those sorts of things. So we are seeing a lot of businesses put in vaccination policies, but those policies are very much each business to their own, and that really needs to be a consideration of the various risks and how the business is run, and those sorts of things too, if you want to put that in place.
Okay, and we're not talking about boosters at all anymore. Everything's just double vaccinated only at the moment, but that's one of the areas that may change as well. That in terms of what the different definition of fully vaccinated is, that may change over time.
Yes, yeah, that's completely true, Julie. At the moment, it is the 2-tick vaccinations that we've got at this stage, but that may change. In Victoria, there is legislation that is due to be passed, and they're looking at just before Christmas at that sort of time frame that may give further clarity to that moving forward when it comes to any booster shots.
So you mentioned before the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. We are currently still under a state of emergency. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, that's correct. The state of emergency in Victoria currently ends on the 18th of November, but it is being extended by declaration in up to about 4-week blocks. So up until the 16th of December, and at that time the state of emergency in Victoria will come to an end unless further legislation is passed. So that's that period. I think from memory it's the sort of, I think it was a 21 month period where a state of emergency can be announced by government in accordance with that Public Health and Wellbeing Act. However, it will come to an end unless further legislation is passed at the end of this year.
Okay, and let's just go down that path. If the further legislation isn't passed and we do end the state of emergency, does that also mean any mandated vaccinations are no longer relevant to us?
Yeah, that's correct, Julie. I mean, at this stage, if the state of emergency ends, the public health directions are no longer able to be enacted by the government and directed by them in accordance with the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, then it may be that these vaccinations and the requirement for mandatory vaccinations also ceases at that stage. However, in saying that, there is legislation in Victoria, there it is through the Parliament at the moment, and I think it is likely that that legislation in some form will be enacted. We just don't know yet what that will look like in certain terms.
Hence the level of upset.
Yes.
The current protesters that are sitting on the steps of Parliament at the moment that you mentioned. Now, in terms of the state of emergency, Public Health and Wellbeing Act and Fair Work, I mean, we've always had to make sure that everything that we do as employers falls in line with Fair Work standards. Where does all that lie?
So the Fair Work Ombudsman has actually come out with a few sort of tips and things for businesses and provided some guidance really on what, I guess they're looking at it from a mandatory vaccination point and sort of what is reasonable for employers and employees to be requesting of their employees in terms of mandatory vaccinations. And there's a number of different tiers on, you're looking at what your business does and really the risk factors. For example, if employees were asked to be working in hotel quarantine or border control, for example, they may be at a higher risk compared to if you're then looking at ones for dental, for example, close contact with people who have, you've still got the health impacts, you're working in healthcare. That's a different tier. And so as a business, you really need to look at exactly what you are doing. You're looking at how your employees work in different areas. You may have an administrative staff member who works solely away from patients in your dental practice. They may not even come in close contact with any sort of patients. And so that really has then, a lot of guidance has been brought around that to give employers a better idea of where Fair Work lies in terms of mandating, a business mandating vaccination policies as compared to the government doing that. So obviously at the moment we have the government mandating it for dental staff members, but if a dental practice also wanted to put in place a policy around that was internal to their business, the Fair Work has provided some guidance on whether or not that looks to be lawful and reasonable.
Okay, so if people got questions around the policies that they're making for their own specific business and they want to make sure that that's a reasonable thing to put in place for their business, their best step is to actually contact Fair Work and be guided by them.
Yes, definitely, and obviously your professional advisors, your legal advisors as well, because there is a lot around policies. You have obligations as employers for workplace health and safety considerations, but on the other side of things, if you're mandating policies, that could amount to things such as unlawful discrimination or breaches of an employment contract. So the key question for any sort of policy around vaccination in the workplace, it really is whether or not that direction is considered reasonable. And that should be applied to each individual employee on a case-by-case basis rather than across the board for a practice.
Because there is certainly the space too for the few exemptions that are out there. We still need to accommodate for that as well.
Of course, yes. It's there are many exemptions, medical exemptions for not obtaining, not being vaccinated, and it is a personal choice. As much as the government is mandating it in certain areas for certain reasons, it really is. It needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis by businesses and with their employees, and having definitely this consultation process and this really open-minded discussion with them about these sorts of policies and putting them in place.
And that feels right to me as well, rather than you might have a dental practice owner who wants all their staff vaccinated, and you may have a staff member with quite legitimate concerns around it, and recognising that, it is a personal choice, rather than having them kind of butt up against each other in this confusing space at the moment, to bring in, your legal representative in, and maybe a Fair Work representative in, and actually broaden that discussion out to include them, because you guys are the ones that can really help direct that. It becomes less personal between the employer and the employee, and it becomes more of we're just trying to get to a situation where everyone's being looked after as best as possible.
Yeah, of course, Julie, and it is this balance between what an employer is focusing on in terms of health and safety of their employees, and there's such obligations, strict obligations in that regard, but then your employees as well, and managing the both. It is a really difficult position for many firms, many dental practices to keep in mind and decide, I guess, how to proceed if they do come up with if an employee refuses to be vaccinated. And they really should really balance both and see what sort of whether there is any sort of compromise, whether there is any sort of other directions, and sort of a consultation process with that employee to try and resolve the issue.
Yeah. And for the scenario, which I'm imagining is certainly happening in some practices and some businesses where the mandate's coming through, where the employee doesn't want to quit, doesn't feel they have to quit, but the employer certainly feels that they can't continue the employment. In those sort of situations, is the employer quite within their rights to sack a staff member who isn't falling in line with the mandated vaccination policy that their practice may have? And is there any recourse for the employee in that sort of situation, should the situation change and the state of emergency is lifted, for example?
Yes, Julie. So it's really, it goes back to that lawful and reasonable direction. So if a practice has considered, and that's that guidance from the Fair Work Ombudsman about if a policy like that should be, is enacted by an employer, and they've looked at this and they consider that it is a lawful and reasonable direction requiring that a worker be vaccinated, and that employee refuses, then the practice may be able to take that disciplinary action, including termination of employment. However, we caution against getting to that stage if possible, and it is really a consultation process with the employee. It's really considering, and really we encourage you to seek advice, particularly from Fair Work, from your employment lawyers, in that about what options a practice has in that situation.
So employers do have the right to ask the vaccination status of their employees, correct?
That's correct, for dental professionals and those that are included under the public health order at the moment. So the public health order in Victoria, the one that mandates those working in those premises to be vaccinated, requires the employer to collect that vaccination information. So a person's vaccination status constitutes health information, and really that is sensitive information under the Privacy Act, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will understand the privacy obligations that are imposed on them in their dental practices. And so generally most employers may only request and sort of collect sensitive information where the individual consents to that collection, and it's also reasonably necessary to collect that information, and that's under the principles of the Australian privacy principles. So it really is a question of whether or not requesting that information is reasonable, and again shouldn't be asked broadly to all employees, but to those on a case-by-case basis and as reasonably necessary.
Okay, because it's dental and a health service, it is my presumption that that would be compelling reason enough that, yes, it's reasonable that we do go. And so are you saying maybe not say to the whole team you need to submit your vaccination status by a certain date? Is it best to go one-on-one and just I'm just checking in? Do they need to sign? Are they able to sign off on something that they, if they state, yes, I've been double vaccinated for COVID-19, and have that in a written format? Do they then need to disclose all other vaccinations that they've got, or is that all still protected under privacy as well of health information?
It's still protected under the privacy legislation. The difference at the moment, again, is I come back to these public health orders and the mandates that are currently in place in Victoria in particular. So for dental practices in Victoria, there is an obligation to obtain and collect that information from staff members before they can attend the office. Or the premises, the dental surgery. So that is a different situation compared to those premises of work where there is no mandates currently in place, and businesses are thinking about what policies to put in place about obtaining that information. And as long as those policies, again, are in, they've considered the Privacy Act, they've considered the principles about obtaining that information and whether or not it's reasonable to do that, that is where each business needs to think about who they're obtaining that information from and why.
Okay, and the best person to assist them through that, would it be a lawyer like yourself, or that would be the best point of call?
Yes, it would be, definitely. We have assisted a few clients quite recently with particularly their privacy policies because of the obtaining of this sort of information. And so to make sure that you've got a really robust privacy policy in place that's available to all staff, and that they're completely aware of your obligations in how you may disclose that information or how you are collecting it, and that it is being safely secured.
It's a wonderful time to make sure we've got that privacy policy on available, current, and everyone's all over it. Everyone understands it very clearly. That's a truly important step to take, I would imagine. Let me ask you, what are the obligations, what are the protections of health information for patients coming through? Do dental practices have any right to ask a patient, have you been double vaccinated?
So patients are a different area in this, and the public health orders that are currently in place for Victoria don't extend to patients and visitors of healthcare facilities. And so ultimately, Julie, it really, again, then is up to a business whether they require any visitors attending the dental surgery or practice to be vaccinated, and will again depend on the particular circumstances arising from this risk assessment in considering which employees will be in the premises with respect to their business and whether or not they want to be open and encourage the patients to attend the premises as well. Now, if you are obtaining that vaccination status from patients, and as a business you have decided that that is something that you want to do, you want to ensure that all of your patients who are attending are fully vaccinated, then the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, so that's the OAIC, has also published some guidance material to assist businesses in understanding how to collect that personal information from visitors to their premises. So different from your obligations as an employer to obtain your employees' details, this is relating to obtaining information from your patients, and this is for the purpose of the COVID-19 contact tracing. And there's some guidance in that material that includes things, limiting the collection of when it is relevant to do so, the notifying of patients that this information is being collected and is required to be collected, that you're storing that information securely, and that you're advising your patients that it will be destroyed after a reasonable period of time. And there's definitely some things in place that assist with assist with doing that these days with the QR codes that the government have included, that if you're able to ask clients to do that and show your vaccination status, that's an easy way of the business then not having to retain that information.
What happens, where does the surgery stand if the patients who are coming in are saying, what is the vaccination status of the team members here? Are the team members protected from making their personal vaccination status public to any patient that may ask?
That definitely could be a difficult area for a practice to manage if patients are questioning that of their dentists as they're sitting in the chair and making sure that and they are wanting to make sure that they are within the area of someone who is protected from the COVID-19 disease. That information is and should be protected under the privacy, the laws and those privacy principles and the Privacy Act that we've talked about, and that information by employers that an employer has should not be disclosed to patients. It shouldn't be disclosed to other employees. There's obligations to keep that private. That's exactly the purpose of providing that information. The purpose for businesses in obtaining that information is for the protection of their staff members, and with the mandates in place at the moment, they are required to collect that information, but there may be staff members that are exempt from that, from requiring to be vaccinated, and so that information should not be provided on to patients. Of course, with the health orders that are in place in the various states and territories across Australia, that information is open to everyone to view, so it is quite easy to access and to provide, I guess, the patients with some level of comfort in that those places of work, those shops that you attend, those dental surgeries, those doctors that you attend, the people that you are attending on are either required to be vaccinated or have an exemption to do that.
And you raise an interesting point there as well, that I think a lot of practices, they are sharing this information with each other, and the business owners are sharing it with all the other employees, the vaccination status of all of their colleagues within that organisation. But from a privacy perspective, that information should be deemed as medical information that's private to each employee, and each employee deserves that to remain private within the walls of the practice.
Yes, of course. The privacy principles, the Privacy Act, there is a lot around that area in terms of this health information, and a vaccination status is sensitive information under this Act. And so it really, this information is only really needs to be reasonably necessary to one or more of the employer's functions or activities, and needs to be protected. And that is why it's so important to have the privacy policy in place so that all staff members are aware of the circumstances in which an employer may have to disclose that information. And with the public health orders that are currently in place, there is a basis to do that when asked by a authorised officer, and that's defined as someone that is requesting it in relation to the COVID tracing, but otherwise it should not be disclosed. That's really sensitive private information of staff members.
So that leads me into, when we are hiring new staff members, what are our responsibilities? What do we need to be careful of when we're hiring new staff members as well, when we're trying to hire people who are double vaccinated, yet we may not have the rightful place to actually ask that specific question early on in the hiring process?
Again, Julie, that'll really come down to whether or not the mandates are still in place and the public health orders are in place. if there is the role of the employee and how where their risk lies, how client-facing they are, and then whether the business has a mandatory vaccination policy in place if they don't have the public health orders from the governments that are mandated. So all of those things will need to be taken into account as to whether or not it's reasonable to request that information from a new hire.
So I would imagine it might be a prudent thing to have a policy around the management of COVID that a lot of places would, or every place would have that already. But add to that the policy around the mandated vaccinations, that during the period of time that that the Chief Health Officer has made it mandatory, this is our policy, and any applicant that you would like to bring in for an interview or go to the next stage of the recruitment process, that they get issued this policy so they're aware of it moving forward. That might be a good way around that.
Yes, definitely, Julie. And there's a lot around other ways to have these sorts of plans in place at the dental surgery or practices. Obviously, there's requirements at the moment to wear face coverings. There's the COVID safe plan, which is required to be in place at the moment, and that really is to address sort of the health and safety issues arising from COVID-19. You've got your record keeping obligations, and there's things such as the QR code that can help there in terms of certainty that people are attending the premises, but there is tracing in place if an exposure site were to occur.
Well, Rosie, it is a challenging space that we're all in, very challenging for you as everything keeps changing all the time and you need to be on top of all of it. So that must be something that's been distracting you quite a bit lately.
It's such an interesting area, Julie. I mean, we've never faced anything, and I hate to use that word unprecedented, but it's just, we've never faced anything like that. And to have, from a legal position, to have this framework constantly changing, the updates going through as quickly as they have, it is hard for anyone to keep abreast of what is current and what is happening throughout Australia. So I do, please reach out if anyone has any queries about this area or about the current space within which they are wanting to work or wanting to meet with their patients and their employees and get back to this workplace that we knew of back then. Please do so, because it is really a tricky area.
And we all just want to make sure we're doing the right thing by each other and for the health of the community as well. And it's beyond the normal person now. As you know, you were expressing to me earlier that you had emailed everybody in your practice, and then all of a sudden within a few hours things had already changed. So how can we, working in dental practices, think that we could be on top of it? I think the impact is so enormous, reaching out and actually getting proper advice, making sure that the policies within your practice are going to be working well to protect you, your team members and your patients. It is really the best step to take, and I encourage all of our listeners to reach out to you guys or their own legal representation and find out the best next steps to make sure that it is there's least amount of disruption to your practice as possible, and that all the team members feel properly protected.
So true, Julie. It's so important, and that's such great advice moving forward for everyone in their practices.
And Rosie has given me a link to the Australian Privacy Principles, so that's going to be in the show notes. Do have a look through that. That's a very useful piece of information to become aware of and moving forward as well. As always, we always like to say on this podcast that this is just general information only for legal representative. For legal advice, please go to your legal representative. But such gratitude around Burke Associates Lawyers for helping us in so many different ways, specifically the COVID mandated vaccination space today. Thank you, Rosie.
Thanks so much, Julie.
Hey, if you enjoyed listening to this episode, you should join the club. The club members receive an online lunch and learn every week where I share insights, systems and strategies to improve the success of your practice. These lunch and learns could not be easier. They are recording so you can watch them at a time that suit you. Members also have full access to the library of all of our past topics. There's a powerful and effective way to upskill your team. I hope to see you there.